He stood frozen on the sidewalk, the glass window reflecting a boy who didn't yet understand why his joy had just been ripped away. Inside the store, his own music played softly. Outside, the world suddenly felt cold, loud, and unfair. This was the day a 12-year-old Michael Jackson learned how cruel silence could be. The brick wall of Henderson's Records in Gary, Indiana, looked ordinary in 1970. A neighborhood record store like any other, its front window packed with vinyl sleeves and handwritten signs promising the latest hits. But to Michael Jackson, that place felt magical. Just weeks earlier, "I Want You Back" by the Jackson 5 had climbed all the way to #1 on the charts. For the first time in his young life, Michael wasn't just performing for crowds. His voice lived inside record sleeves, spinning on turntables across America. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. So that afternoon, Michael Jackson, only 12 years old, walked into Henderson's Records with the quiet excitement of a child chasing proof that his dream was real. He wasn't dressed like a star. No security, no entourage. Just a slim black boy with a soft afro, wearing everyday clothes, stepping carefully between the aisles. He scanned the shelves, heart racing, looking for the familiar faces of his brothers, looking for his own smile printed in glossy ink. He never reached the display. Before Michael Jackson could touch a single record, a hand grabbed his arm. A security guard, bigger, older, louder, yanked him backward. There were no questions, no explanations, no accusations of stealing or causing trouble, just one sentence that cut deeper than any insult: "Get out of here." In seconds, Michael Jackson was shoved back onto the sidewalk. The door slammed behind him. Inside the store, customers kept browsing, records kept spinning. "I Want You Back" kept playing. But outside, Michael stood alone, confused and humiliated. He didn't understand why he had been thrown out of a store that sold his own music. He didn't understand why no one listened when he tried to explain. All he knew was that something about who he was made him unwelcome. He was kicked out for being black. That moment didn't make headlines. No reporter stood nearby. No camera captured the tears he fought back. It was just one small injustice in a country full of them. But for Michael Jackson, it burned itself into memory. It became a quiet scar he carried long after the charts moved on, long after the applause faded. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss another untold story. In 1970, Michael Jackson was already famous, but he was still a child trying to understand a world that applauded his talent while rejecting his presence. On stage, he was adored. Off stage, he was invisible, or worse, unwanted. That contradiction followed him everywhere. He could sell out venues, yet still be treated as a threat in places where he should have felt safe. Years passed. Childhood disappeared behind tour buses, rehearsal rooms, and flashing cameras. Michael Jackson grew up faster than he should have. The boy who once stood outside Henderson's Records became a global phenomenon. His voice matured, his moves changed music forever, and his name became known in every corner of the world. Fame gave him power, but it also gave him distance, from normal life, from ordinary moments, from the boy he used to be. But some memories don't fade. No matter how many awards Michael Jackson won, no matter how many millions of records he sold, the memory of that day in Gary stayed with him. Not as anger screaming for revenge, but as a quiet reminder of how humiliation feels when you're powerless. 20 years later, everything had changed. The year was different, the world was different, and Michael Jackson was no longer a child walking alone into a record store. He was the king of pop, one of the most influential artists in history. His name didn't just sell records, it shaped culture. Wherever he went, cameras followed. Wherever he stood, history listened. And one day, Michael Jackson returned to Henderson's Records. The same brick walls stood there, the same neighborhood streets, but the energy was different. Word had spread quickly. Michael Jackson was coming back. People gathered. Employees whispered nervously. No one recognized the boy from 20 years earlier, but everyone knew the man stepping toward the door. This time, the doors didn't slam shut. They opened. Michael Jackson walked in slowly, not with arrogance, not with anger, but with intention. Every step echoed with memory. The shelves were still filled with records, but now they carried his legacy. Albums that had changed the industry, albums that had changed lives. Thriller, Bad, Off the Wall. His music was everywhere. And then the truth came out. Michael Jackson wasn't there to shop. He was there because he owned the place. Quietly, without fanfare, Michael Jackson had purchased Henderson's Records. The same store that had thrown him out as a child now belonged to him, not as a trophy, not as a weapon, but as a statement. People expected revenge. They expected firings, public shamming, dramatic confrontations. That's how stories like this usually end. But Michael Jackson chose something else. He chose transformation. Instead of punishing the past, he rewrote the future. Michael Jackson made sure the store would never discriminate again. He invested in the community. He ensured that the space became welcoming, inclusive, and respectful, especially to the children who walked in with dreams bigger than their pockets. For Michael Jackson, ownership wasn't about power. It was about healing. He never made a spectacle of it. No press conference. No triumphant speech. The story spread quietly, almost like a rumor, until people realized what it truly meant. A boy who had been humiliated returned not to destroy, but to protect others from experiencing the same pain. That choice revealed something deeper about Michael Jackson. Behind the fame, behind the costumes and choreography, lived a man who never forgot what it felt like to be small. He understood that revenge might feel satisfying, but it doesn't erase the wound. Only compassion does. Only change does. Michael Jackson didn't buy the store to prove he had won. He bought it to prove that the world could be better than it was. The irony is impossible to ignore. The same building that once rejected him now stood as a symbol of his resilience. The same doorway that pushed him out now welcomed everyone in. It wasn't just about a record store. It was about reclaiming dignity. For fans, this story adds another layer to Michael Jackson's legacy. His music taught people how to dance, how to feel, how to dream. But his actions taught something even more powerful: how to respond to injustice without becoming it. In a world obsessed with clapbacks and payback, Michael Jackson chose growth. That 12-year-old boy standing outside Henderson's Records could never have imagined this ending. He couldn't have known that pain would one day turn into purpose. But that's the power of time, and that's the power of character. Michael Jackson didn't erase the past. He honored it by making sure it wouldn't repeat itself. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. The story does not end at the doorway of that record store. In many ways, that doorway was only the beginning of something far larger, something that echoed through every chapter of Michael Jackson's life that followed. Because what happened in Henderson's Records was not an isolated wound. It was a mirror of the world Michael Jackson was forced to grow up in, a world that celebrated his gift but questioned his worth. After that day in 1970, Michael Jackson rarely spoke about the incident publicly. Not because it didn't matter, but because pain like that often learns how to hide. It settles into the quiet places of the heart, shaping decisions in ways even the person carrying it may not fully realize. For Michael, that memory became part of his internal compass, guiding how he treated others, how he saw injustice, and how deeply he empathized with people who felt unseen. As the Jackson 5 exploded in popularity, the irony grew sharper. Michael Jackson could perform in front of screaming crowds one night and still be followed suspiciously in a store the next day. He could shake hands with powerful executives and still feel the weight of prejudice in ordinary spaces. Fame did not shield him from racism. Sometimes, it only made the contrast more painful. Behind closed doors, Michael Jackson was absorbing everything. He listened more than he spoke. He watched how adults behaved when cameras were on, and how they behaved when they thought no one important was watching. He learned early that applause was conditional, and acceptance could be withdrawn without warning. That lesson shaped his obsession with control, perfection, and safety later in life. As he grew older and stepped out from the shadow of his family, Michael Jackson transformed himself artistically. Off the Wall wasn't just an album, it was a declaration of independence. Thriller wasn't just music, it was a cultural earthquake. With every release, he broke records that were never meant to be broken by someone who looked like him. And yet, even at the peak of his power, Michael Jackson never forgot the feeling of being pushed out of a place where he belonged. That memory resurfaced in subtle ways. It appeared in his philanthropy, in his deep connection to children, and in his fierce desire to create spaces where innocence could exist without fear. Neverland was not built as an escape from fame alone. It was built as a response to a childhood interrupted by cruelty and pressure. Michael Jackson wanted to create the world he never fully had. The decision to buy Henderson's records did not come from impulse. It came from reflection. According to people close to him, Michael had spoken quietly about the store years before the purchase, not with bitterness, but with sadness. He wondered how many other children had been made to feel small there. He wondered how many dreams had been dimmed by a single act of prejudice. When the opportunity arose to buy the property, Michael Jackson didn't hesitate, but he also didn't announce it. There was no press release, no headline screaming revenge. He didn't want the world to see a triumphant comeback. He wanted to quietly correct a wrong. Employees who were there at the time later described the moment they realized who the new owner was. There was shock. There was fear. Some expected anger, but Michael Jackson never raised his voice. He never pointed fingers. Instead, he spoke calmly about respect, dignity, and responsibility. He made it clear that the store would serve everyone, or it would not serve at all. That moment became legendary among those who witnessed it, not because of drama, but because of restraint. Michael Jackson understood something many people never learn. Revenge gives you a moment, but compassion gives you a legacy. As the years went on, stories like this continued to surface: quiet acts of generosity, private donations, unpublicized interventions. Michael Jackson paid for children's surgeries. He funded schools. He supported families without asking for recognition. He did these things not to polish his image, but because he recognized pain when he saw it. He had lived it. Critics often misunderstood him. They saw eccentricity where there was trauma. They saw isolation where there was self-protection. The world loved the spectacle of Michael Jackson, but it rarely took the time to understand the human being beneath it. Yet stories like Henderson's records reveal a clearer picture of who he truly was. Michael Jackson was a man shaped by contradiction, powerful yet vulnerable, celebrated yet wounded. He knew what it meant to be adored for his talent and dismissed for his existence. That duality lived inside his music, his dance, and his choices. When Michael Jackson sang about injustice, it wasn't abstract. When he sang about healing the world, it wasn't a slogan. It was personal. Songs like Man in the Mirror weren't written from a pedestal. They were written from memory, from moments like the one outside that record store. That is why this story matters. It reminds us that history isn't only shaped by grand speeches and public victories. Sometimes it's shaped by a boy standing alone on a sidewalk, learning a lesson he never asked for. Sometimes it's shaped by what that boy chooses to do decades later, when the power dynamic has finally shifted. Michael Jackson could have erased Henderson's records. He could have turned it into a headline. Instead, he turned it into a promise. A promise that no child would be judged before being known. A promise that no dream would be dismissed at the door. A promise that pain would not be passed forward. In the end, this is not just a story about racism or redemption. It is a story about choice, about what we do when the world shows us its worst side. Do we return the damage, or do we transform it? Michael Jackson made his choice. And through that choice, he left behind something far more enduring than a chart-topping hit. He left behind an example. The deeper truth is that Henderson's Records was never just a building in Gary, Indiana. It became a symbol, one that followed Michael Jackson quietly, persistently, through every phase of his life. Long after the applause faded and the lights dimmed, that memory continued to whisper to him, reminding him of the cost of being different in a world that fears what it doesn't understand. As the 1980s arrived, Michael Jackson entered a level of fame that humanity had never witnessed before. Thriller didn't simply dominate charts, it rewrote the rules of global culture. His face was everywhere, his voice unavoidable, his dance moves copied by millions. He was no longer just a musician, he was a phenomenon. And yet, behind the curtain of superstardom, Michael Jackson still carried the same emotional blueprint shaped by childhood moments of rejection. The irony was cruel. The same society that once pushed him out of a record store now depended on him to sell records, magazines, concert tickets, and dreams. Corporate America embraced his profitability, but genuine acceptance remained conditional. Even at the peak of his success, Michael Jackson encountered resistance when he tried to expand beyond what the world felt comfortable allowing him to be. When he began breaking racial barriers on MTV, it wasn't handed to him as recognition. It was fought for. Executives hesitated. Networks resisted. Doors opened only after he forced them open with undeniable excellence. Just like that day in 1970, Michael Jackson had to prove he belonged somewhere that should have welcomed him automatically. And he never forgot that. Friends close to Michael often noticed how deeply he observed people. He paid attention to who treated waitstaff kindly, who spoke over others, who dismissed people quietly instead of loudly. These observations shaped how he navigated fame. He learned early that cruelty doesn't always announce itself. It often disguises itself as routine behavior. That awareness fueled his obsession with fairness. On tour, Michael Jackson insisted on diverse crews. He paid people above industry standards when he felt they were undervalued. He corrected staff privately instead of humiliating them publicly. These were not random acts of kindness. They were deliberate choices made by someone who knew exactly how power could be abused. The Henderson's Records incident was one of the earliest moments where Michael Jackson learned what unchecked authority could do to a child's spirit. And he vowed, silently, that if he ever held power, he would use it differently. As his empire grew, so did the pressure. Fame brought not just admiration but suspicion. Rumors followed him. Misunderstandings multiplied. The media, once eager to celebrate him, became equally eager to tear him apart. And once again, Michael Jackson found himself judged not for what he did, but for who people believed he was. History began to repeat itself. The boy who was once thrown out of a store for being black became a man scrutinized for being different, sensitive, unconventional. The reasons changed, but the mechanism remained the same. Exclusion disguised as concern, judgment disguised as curiosity. Through it all, Michael Jackson rarely responded with bitterness. Instead, he poured his emotions into his art. His music became darker, deeper, more reflective. Albums like Dangerous and H.I. Story weren't just entertainment, they were testimonies. They spoke of paranoia, injustice, isolation, and the desire to be understood. When Michael Jackson sang, "They don't really care about us," it wasn't rhetoric, it was lived experience. The Henderson's Records story resurfaced again in his later years, often shared by those who wanted to understand why Michael Jackson cared so deeply about social issues, why he donated so much without publicity, why he seemed more comfortable around children than powerful adults. The answer was always the same. He never forgot what it felt like to be powerless. Even as legal battles and media storms surrounded him, Michael Jackson continued to believe in redemption. He believed people could change, systems could improve, and pain could be transformed into something meaningful. That belief wasn't naive. It was intentional. It was a refusal to let the world harden him. When he passed away, the world mourned the loss of an icon. But stories like this remind us that we also lost a quiet humanitarian, a deeply wounded soul who chose empathy over resentment again and again. The legacy of Michael Jackson is often discussed in terms of music, dance, and fame. But his true legacy lives in moments like Henderson's records, in the unseen decisions, the silent corrections of injustice, the deliberate choice to uplift instead of destroy. That record store still stands in memory not because of what it did wrong, but because of how Michael Jackson responded to it decades later. He turned a place of exclusion into a lesson in grace. He demonstrated that power doesn't have to roar to be effective. It can whisper and still change everything. And perhaps that is the most powerful part of this story. Not that Michael Jackson was kicked out, not that he came back as an owner, but that he chose compassion when the world expected vengeance. In a culture addicted to public takedowns and viral outrage, Michael Jackson's response feels almost radical. He didn't seek validation through destruction. He sought healing through ownership, not of a building but of his narrative. That is why this story continues to resonate. Because somewhere right now, a child is being dismissed, judged, or pushed aside for reasons they don't yet understand. And someday that child will have a choice: repeat the cycle or break it. Michael Jackson showed us how to break it. The story continues far beyond the walls of that record store, because moments like that do not simply pass through a life. They anchor themselves to it. For Michael Jackson, Henderson's records became one of those anchors, quietly shaping how he understood power, justice, and the responsibility that comes with being seen. As the world watched Michael Jackson dominate the 1980s, few realized how carefully he guarded his inner world. Fame surrounded him like a fortress, but inside that fortress lived a child who had learned early that love could be conditional. Applause could vanish, doors could close without explanation, and safety, once taken for granted, could be withdrawn in an instant. That understanding made Michael Jackson unusually sensitive to the emotional states of others. He noticed discomfort before it became visible. He sensed fear before it turned into words. People who spent time with him often said he asked questions others didn't think to ask. Are you okay? Did that hurt you? Do you feel safe here? Those weren't scripted gestures. They were instincts, sharpened by memory. When Michael Jackson traveled, he paid attention to the places that felt unwelcoming. Hotels that treated staff poorly. Venues that segregated audiences subtly. Cities where certain neighborhoods were avoided without explanation. He saw patterns others ignored, because he had lived inside one of those patterns at age 12, standing outside a store that sold his own voice but rejected his presence. This awareness seeped into his creative choices. His short films weren't just visual spectacles, they were emotional statements. In Beat It, he imagined a world where violence could be diffused through unity. In Bad, he challenged stereotypes about identity and worth. In Black or White, he confronted racism directly, demanding a world that judged character instead of skin. None of that came from theory. It came from lived experience. The Henderson's records incident wasn't the only time Michael Jackson encountered racism, but it was one of the first times it arrived without disguise. There was no polite smile, no subtle exclusion, just hands on his arm and a command to leave. That bluntness left a mark. It taught him that injustice doesn't always need justification, it only needs authority. That lesson stayed with him as he watched the media turn on him in later years. He recognized the pattern immediately. Assumptions made without listening. Narratives formed without evidence. Judgment delivered without empathy. The same mechanism that once labeled a 12-year-old boy as suspicious now labeled a global icon as strange, dangerous, or untrustworthy. Michael Jackson felt the repetition deeply. Those close to him said he often struggled not with anger, but with confusion. He couldn't understand how the world could love his art so fiercely while questioning his humanity so casually. That contradiction exhausted him. It made him retreat inward, searching for places where he could exist without explanation. And yet, despite the pressure, he never stopped giving. Quiet generosity became his language. He funded children's hospitals anonymously. He paid rent for families he had never met. He visited sick children in the middle of tour, sometimes staying longer than scheduled, listening to their stories as if time didn't exist. These weren't publicity stunts. Many of them were discovered only after his death, pieced together by grateful families who never expected recognition. Why did Michael Jackson give so much? Because he remembered what it felt like to have something taken away for no reason. In interviews, when asked about his compassion for children, Michael Jackson often spoke about innocence, not as an abstract idea, but as something fragile and easily broken. He knew how quickly joy could turn into shame, how fast excitement could turn into fear. That transformation happened to him in seconds outside Henderson's records. That is why the story of him buying the store matters so much. It wasn't just a business decision. It was a symbolic reclaiming of innocence, a way of telling his younger self, you didn't imagine it, what happened was wrong, and you deserved better. Psychologists often say that healing doesn't come from forgetting trauma, it comes from rewriting its meaning. Michael Jackson did exactly that. He took a memory rooted in humiliation and turned it into an act rooted in dignity. He didn't erase the past, he reframed it. As years went on, people who learned about the Henderson's record story began to see Michael Jackson differently. The narrative shifted. He wasn't just an eccentric superstar. He was a man responding to a lifetime of contradiction with extraordinary restraint. Even his silence made more sense. Michael Jackson understood that speaking out doesn't always create change. Sometimes it creates noise. Instead, he chose action, ownership, investment, structural change. By buying the store, he ensured that the power to exclude no longer belonged to someone else. He placed it in hands guided by empathy. That choice reflected his broader philosophy. When he acquired music catalogs, it wasn't just about money, it was about control over creative legacy. When he built Neverland, it wasn't just about escape, it was about creating a world where childhood could exist without threat. When he donated millions, it wasn't about headlines, it was about relief. Michael Jackson believed that if you had power, you had responsibility. That belief became increasingly rare as fame grew more isolating. The higher he rose, the fewer people challenged him honestly. The fewer people understood him completely. And yet, he remained anchored to moments like the one outside Henderson's records, moments that reminded him who he was before the world decided who he should be. Near the end of his life, Michael Jackson spoke often about legacy. Not awards, not numbers, but impact. He wanted to be remembered for healing, not spectacle, for love, not controversy. Those who listened closely heard a man trying to ensure that his story would not be reduced to headlines. The Henderson's record story is part of that legacy. It reminds us that greatness isn't measured only by success, but by response. Not by how high someone rises, but by how they treat others once they get there. Michael Jackson rose higher than almost anyone in history and still chose compassion. That choice continues to resonate because it feels almost impossible in today's world. We are taught to respond to pain with exposure, to injustice with humiliation, to wrongdoing with destruction. Michael Jackson offered a different model. He showed that transformation can be quieter and stronger. Somewhere in Gary, Indiana, a record store once stood as a reminder of exclusion. Today, it stands as a lesson in grace. Not because it changed on its own, but because someone who was once rejected returned with empathy instead of rage. And that may be the most powerful encore Michael Jackson ever performed. And still, the ripple from that moment continued outward, touching parts of Michael Jackson's life most people never thought to connect. Because when you look closely, you begin to see that the boy outside Henderson's records never truly disappeared. He grew taller. His voice changed. His reach expanded across continents. But inside, that boy remained, watching, remembering, measuring the world by how it treated those with the least power. As Michael Jackson entered the final chapters of his career, his relationship with the public grew more complicated. He was no longer just admired, he was examined. Every gesture was interpreted, every silence was questioned, and once again, judgment arrived before understanding. To many observers, it looked like fame had made him fragile, but those who understood his past knew the truth was far more complex. Michael Jackson had spent his entire life navigating spaces that wanted his talent but not his humanity. That pattern began long before tabloids existed, long before Stadium Tour, long before the crown of King of Pop. It began in places like that record store, where a child learned that success does not automatically grant safety. That lesson hardened him in some ways, but it also softened him in others. It made him acutely aware of how easily people are misjudged, how quickly narratives can be formed without evidence. That awareness shaped how he reacted to controversy. Instead of fighting every accusation publicly, Michael Jackson often retreated inward, not because he was guilty, but because he understood how little space there was for nuance once a story took hold. He had seen it before. He had lived it. The same system that once decided a 12-year-old boy didn't belong in a record store now decided what kind of man he was allowed to be. And yet, even under that pressure, Michael Jackson continued to believe in the possibility of goodness. Friends described him as paradoxically hopeful, wounded but not bitter, cautious but still generous. He believed people could change because he had chosen to change the meaning of his own pain. That belief is what separates his story from so many others. Many people who experience injustice dream of the day they can reverse the power dynamic. Michael Jackson reached that day, and then chose not to exploit it. He didn't return to Henderson's records to make someone else feel small. He returned to make sure no one would ever feel small there again. That distinction matters. It reveals a kind of strength that isn't loud, a kind of courage that doesn't need witnesses. Michael Jackson understood that true power is the ability to break cycles, not perpetuate them. As historians look back on his life, stories like this one are increasingly seen as keys to understanding him. Not the costumes, not the myths, but the quiet decisions that revealed his values, the moments when he could have chosen vengeance and chose responsibility instead. In many ways, Michael Jackson's life can be read as a series of responses to that early lesson in exclusion. Every barrier he broke, every space he reclaimed, every child he protected carried echoes of that first rejection. He wasn't running from it, he was transforming it. And transformation, unlike revenge, lasts. If this continuing chapter has kept you listening, reflecting, and feeling, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story. Because stories like this don't just honor the past, they challenge us to be better in the present.